On May 8, 1945, while the streets of London were flooded with ticker tape and hysterical crowds celebrating the defeat of Nazi Germany, a celebration that cemented Winston Churchill as the savior of the free world, a much darker and colder reality was being suppressed within the classified ledgers of the British Treasury, revealing that the United Kingdom had not simply won a war, but had unknowingly finalized the liquidation of its empire to the United States in a financial transaction that was as ruthless as it was calculated. To fully grasp the magnitude of this geopolitical bankruptcy, one must understand that in 1939, Britain controlled the world's largest economic zone, and the pound sterling was the king of global currencies. Yet the moment the first German tank crossed into Poland, the United States invoked the Neutrality Acts and the cash and carry policy, a brutally pragmatic system which forbade the U.S. from extending credit to belligerent nations, forcing Britain to pay for every bullet, barrel of oil, and sheet of steel in liquid gold, and to transport these goods across the U-boat-infested Atlantic on their own ships. A desperate situation that triggered Operation Fish, the single largest movement of wealth in history, where the Bank of England secretly packed the nation's gold reserves into crates labeled as fish, and shipped them to vaults in Canada and New York, effectively draining the empire's accumulated wealth of 3 centuries in less than 18 months. By late 1940, the British Treasury was empty, a fact that forced Churchill to essentially beg President Roosevelt for a lifeline, resulting in the destroyers for bases deal, which history often paints as an act of friendship, but was, in reality, a predatory exchange where the U.S. offloaded 50 obsolete, rusting World War I destroyers, ships that frequently broke down and had poor turning circles, in exchange for priceless 99-year leases on strategically vital British territories in Newfoundland, the Caribbean, and British Guiana. A move that permanently dismantled the Royal Navy, IS dominance in the Western Hemisphere, and allowed the U.S. to construct a global military footprint on British soil for free. As the war dragged on and Britain's insolvency became undeniable, Roosevelt introduced the Lend-Lease Act in 1941, publicly marketing it with the benevolent analogy of lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house is on fire. Yet the private negotiations were far more hostile, particularly regarding the consideration the U.S. demanded in return, which was codified in the controversial Article 7 of the Lend-Lease Agreement, a clause specifically designed by the U.S. State Department to destroy imperial preference, the system that protected British trade, thereby forcing Britain to dismantle its economic barriers and allowing American corporations to flood the markets of the British Commonwealth, ensuring that post-war trade would benefit American factories rather than British ones. This stripping of assets wasn't just financial, but technological, most notably during the 1940 Tizard mission, where a British delegation, desperate for American manufacturing capacity, traveled to Washington with a black metal deed box containing the crown jewels of British military research, handing over the blueprints for the cavity magnetron, which the Americans described as the most valuable cargo ever brought to their shores because it made miniaturized radar possible, along with the designs for the jet engine and the critical Moyud committee report proving the feasibility of the atomic bomb, intellectual property worth billions that the U.S. absorbed to build its own military-industrial complex, while later passing the McMahon Act of 1946 to legally bar the U.K. from accessing the very nuclear technology they had helped create. The economic coup de grace, however, was orchestrated at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, where the United States, now holding 2/3 of the world's gold reserves, largely acquired from Britain and its allies, used its leverage to crush the proposals of British economist John Maynard Keynes, who sought a fair global clearing system, and, instead, installed the U.S. dollar as the world's sole reserve currency backed by gold, effectively demoting the pound sterling and ensuring that Britain would forever be dependent on dollar-based trade. The brutality of this transition was laid bare the moment Japan surrendered in August 1945, when President Truman, without warning, abruptly canceled Lend-Lease, causing supply ships heading for Liverpool to turn around in the middle of the ocean, leaving a bombed-out Britain facing immediate starvation and forcing a humiliated Keynes to travel to Washington to plead for a grant, only to be rejected, and offered the 1946 Anglo-American Loan instead, a $3.75 billion commercial loan, with the catastrophic condition that Britain must make the pound fully convertible to the dollar within 1 year, a clause that Keynes warned was a death sentence for the economy. When this convertibility was activated in 1947, exactly as predicted, international markets lost confidence in the war-weary UK and frantically dumped the pound to buy the dollar, draining Britain's remaining reserves in a matter of weeks and precipitating a crisis so severe that the British government was forced to ration bread, something that had never happened even during the height of the Nazi submarine blockades. This financial dependency meant that for the next half-century, London could not make a foreign policy decision without checking its bank balance in Washington, a reality that culminated in the Suez Crisis of 1956, when Britain, France, and Israel invaded Egypt to reclaim the Suez Canal, and President Eisenhower, rather than sending troops, simply ordered the U.S. Treasury to prepare to sell its massive holdings of sterling, a threat that would have collapsed the British economy overnight, forcing a humiliating British retreat and signaling the definitive end of the British Empire as a global superpower. The depth of this debt was so profound that it wasn't until December 29, 2006, that the British government finally transferred the last payment of $83 million to the United States, officially closing the account on World War II, and proving that, while the soldiers of the British Empire defeated the fascism of the Axis powers, it was the accountants of the United States who ultimately conquered the British Empire, leaving the U.S. as the undisputed landlord of the 20th century.